You never expect the people who are supposed to be your blood to treat your life like a buffet, browse, take what they want, and leave the plate half empty. Never. That's the weird thing about betrayal. It never looks like betrayal at first. It looks like small things, tolerable things, the kinds of things you tell yourself are temporary. Until they aren't. My son and I had a relationship that, from the outside, looked normal. We ate dinner together when we could. We argued about stupid things, the thermostat setting, the way he never replaced the toilet paper roll properly, the endless string of half-finished projects in his bedroom-cum-storage room. He called me when he needed a ride. I sent him texts reminding him to eat. He called me mom, in the same way he called me home. It was routine, comfortable, familiar. Inside the routines, though, there was entitlement. Little things at first. Can you spot me for rent? He'd ask. Always the tone of a man doing you a favor by asking. Can you cover this utility bill? I'll pay you back next month. I'd tell myself I'd been there once. When I was his age, I'd needed help too. So I helped. Because that's what parents do. The first 3 times, it felt like charity. The 4th and 5th and 10th times, it started to feel like a pattern. A pattern that smelled less like my kid needs help and more like my kid expects help. He had excuses, work slow, mom. My car broke down. I'll get a second shift. The promises piled up like unpaid invoices. You can tolerate so much if you tell yourself the right story. You can tolerate temporary if you want to be the good parent. I want to be the good parent. I still do. But being good doesn't mean being a doormat for people who are willing to cross boundaries. So often they stop being boundaries and become open doors. The theft didn't start as a dramatic break-in. It started with a small imbalance. My check register was a little off. My credit card balance was higher than it should have been. A withdrawal here, a charge there. At first I blamed myself. Old age? Sleepwalking? Responsibility fatigue? I'm not going to pretend I'm perfect with money. I'm not. But I am enough of an adult to notice when things are moving the wrong way. I went through stacks of paper on a Tuesday after I'd come home from work. The house smelled like Tuesday. The leftover scent of something bland I'd heated in the microwave for dinner. The television was running on mute in the living room because he always left it that way when he was home. He was there, actually late to work, early from wherever he'd been, face pale and head down over his phone. He looked up when I walked in the kitchen. Hey, Mom, he said. Long day. The way he said it should have been casual. It wasn't. I tapped the calculator app, added numbers, subtracted, and stared at the results. There was a withdrawal from the bank the day last week I hadn't made. There was an overnight transfer I couldn't explain. One of my credit card statements had a charge for an expensive online purchase that I recognized, except for the seller name. I printed it out because paper helps. Paper makes things real. Can I help with the groceries? He asked, peering in the fridge. His hand brushed against mine when I stood to show him the printout. What's that? He asked, eyes on the page. This, I said flat. This withdrawal. This charge. I kept my voice steady because the minute I lost it, I felt like I'd give him the power to tug me back into chaos. He swallowed. He played dumb for a second, and then his face changed into the look I know too well. Shrinking, but also calculating. He reached for the page, fingers barely grazing mine. Must be a mistake, Mom, he said. Banks make mistakes all the time. You have an online account with this vendor? I asked. Does your debit show that transfer? He shook his head. No, I don't. The truth in the way he hesitated hit me like something cold. I felt my stomach drop. I knew then it wasn't a bank error. Do you have anything to tell me? I asked. Silence. Then small, defensive words. Mom, it's not like that. I would never. So you admit nothing? I pressed. He said, almost a whisper, I'm sorry. Sorry. It is the most useful little word when you want to leave a bruise and keep people guessing. I demanded an explanation. He gave me stories. I paid a bill for a buddy. I used your card because mine was declined. I meant to pay you back. The script was old, reheated, generic. It fit all the corners his excuses always fit into. I recognized the pattern. I'd heard the lines before. I told him to open his wallet. He did. Empty. Again, a familiar scene. Asking for proofs, receipts, showing me where he'd spent money in the last week. His phone had call logs and texts. He let me glance. Many things I didn't recognize. A message from someone I didn't know. A screenshot of something pricey he'd posted. He swore until he was blue in the face, until he wasn't swearing at all and just staring at his shoes. It was ugly. It felt personal. It felt like my chest had been hollowed out and replaced with lead. The money was my emergency fund. The money was the cushion I'd built when I'd been career-oriented once, before layoffs, before slow months, before I'd had to help him scrape by again and again. I thought of all the times I'd told myself it would be worth it, that love isn't transactional. But this wasn't love. This was theft, thinly veiled by the vocabulary of entitlement. I told him to leave. It was immediate and harsh and necessary. Go sleep in your car if you have to, I said. Don't come back until you can explain this to me and put the money back. He left, but not before making a scene. He shouted that I loved him only when he behaved like I wanted him to, that I was cruel, cold, that I didn't understand what it was like to be young and struggle. He slammed the door with a little more force than I expected from someone who could have left quietly. The neighbors would probably talk tomorrow. Let them. My shame wasn't for them to digest. It was mine to process, and I had choices. After he was gone, I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against a cabinet and let myself breathe. I let the quiet in like an ally. For weeks after, I'd been blaming my own scatterbrain. This time I felt clarity, clear intent, the kind that sharpens focus. When the police insist on reality, did you want to press charges? It's tough. In the movies, you storm into a precinct with your hair up and demand justice. In real life, people you love have faces and voices that snag at the easy muscles of empathy. I had that moment. I called a lawyer. I jotted down the withdrawals, the card statements, the days my son had been less than truthful. I called a counselor to set an appointment for myself because the violation of trust had layers and I walked outside to get air. I told my neighbor only that night because she noticed my hands shaking and brought over tea. She was bright, younger than me, and one of the few people who'd seen my son at his worst and at his best. She gave me a look that combined sorrow and something else. Approval, maybe, for doing a thing so hard to do. She didn't say press charges. She said, quietly, you have to protect yourself. Protect myself. That phrase is heavy in a parent's mouth. We don't often get to choose to protect ourselves from our children. The default setting is protect your child, no matter what. But sometimes protection looks like building a fence, rather than letting someone live in your house, eating the wallpaper. The first night after he left, I didn't sit and wait for some grand closure. I didn't cry into the cushion until it was flat. Instead, I pulled out the old shoebox, receipts, small keepsakes, that ridiculous birthday card he made in elementary school where he glued macaroni into the shape of a heart, and I set it on the table. There was a small stack of paid bills I hadn't reconciled because mornings had felt like busy places. I pulled them one by one, lined them up on the counter, and checked numbers. Numbers help. They make the world less melodramatic and more factual. People would ask, why not call the police? Why not take immediate legal action? The answer is complicated. Part of it was maternal instinct. You want your child safe. Another part was exhaustion. The energy required to embroil your family in more visible legal trouble is immense. What I wanted first was to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to make sure the line between helping and being taken for granted was clear. But there was also this small, growing ember of something darker, a streak of petty stubbornness that I had known I'd kept wrapped up under kindness. He had taken my money. He had taken my trust. He had carried himself with a kind of arrogant assumption that everything I had was his because he was my son. That presumption deserved to be punctured. It is a strange thing to realize you have a mean streak, and then to decide to use it with surgical precision. I didn't want to ruin him. I told myself this and believed it. I didn't want lifelong damage. I wanted him to feel the cost of crossing the line. I wanted him to understand that some doors don't swing back open just because you want them to. I wanted him to feel uncomfortable enough to change, or to let me stop worrying about whether he would. The next day, I began the quiet work. Petty revenge, I decided, would be my tool of choice, not messy criminality, not public shaming. Real petty is slow, relentless, and personal. It doesn't make news. It makes character tests. I started small. I changed passwords. Not because he had any direct access to my digital accounts. I'd never given him the password to the main ones, but because he was the kind of person who might remember casual hints, your dog's name, your childhood street. I replaced security questions. I logged out of devices. The tiny administrative acts felt like armor. Then I instituted a no cash, no lend rule in my head. For years I'd been able to excuse spot loans as investments in him. No more. I called the bank and set alerts on transfers over a small amount. I arranged for automatic payments for my bills, so there was a line the money had to cross before I could spend it. Small inconveniences for me, sizable obstacles for someone used to picking up a phone and asking for a lift. I also wrote a list, not spiteful or out loud, a list of boundaries, things I wouldn't do again, things I wouldn't excuse. No bailouts for impulsive spending, I wrote. No covers for cards unless I see receipts. The list felt like a contract I was finally allowing myself to sign. There is a particular kind of humiliation when your child violates your trust. It's not just about the money. It's about being the person who taught them to respect rules and who gladly did favors. When they exploit that, you feel like the fool in every joke. I wanted to ensure I didn't feel like that again. One morning, before dawn, a realization landed. He'd been sloppy. His purchases left clues. Online accounts, memberships, registrations, he had used details in ways that could be tracked. Not that I intended to drag him down, but the idea of him getting a cold wake-up call, of him learning that the safety net wasn't infinite, that it might have consequences, became the seed of the revenge I was about to choose. That seed wasn't vengeance in the headline sense. It wasn't threats or blackmail. It was petty, meticulous, and personal. I planned to weaponize accountability rather than violence. I would give him small losses he couldn't immediately shrug off. I would make sure he understood the practical impact of his behavior. I would let natural consequences accumulate long enough they'd be unavoidable. You may be asking right now, what is petty revenge even look like when your son tried to rob you? At this stage, it looked like drawing a boundary so firmly he'd bruise against it. It looked like turning my life into a place where theft wasn't profitable. It looked like me learning to laugh again, small and private, when I saw him trying to negotiate his way back without having first paid the price. I took the family calendar and blacked out days I would no longer be a convenience. He was, for many years, the kind of person who'd call at the last minute to pick up something from our house, or to use my car because his was in the shop. That would stop. I posted a note on the fridge that said, simply, help yourself to food. Ask before you take anything else. A small, practical jab, not cruel, but clear. It was petty in the sense of being deliberate daily inconvenience. Petty like a parent who had tired of being used. Petty like the person who, having been taken for granted, finally decided to assign a cost. And beneath all the practicalities, there was a darker, more delicious plan. Not to shame him publicly, but to make him lose the kind of reputational credit he'd used to charm his way out of things. He'd been the guy who could always talk his way into forgiveness. He'd smile and say, I messed up, and people would line up to buy that apology. I wanted a process that made his apologies less effective. So I gathered documents, small evidences, receipts, bank statements, a printed list of unfamiliar charges. The paperwork felt like a talisman. I knew how uncomfortable it would be for him to be seen with those in front of neutral witnesses. The paper made the abstract concrete. It made it harder for people to excuse him away with a joke. I'll be honest, in the back of my mind, the world's voice nags at you, don't go too far. You could hurt him. That small voice mattered, and I listened to it. My revenge would have limits. It wouldn't be about permanent ruptures, about criminal press, or trying to ruin him for good. It would be about practical consequences and reclaiming dignity. I wanted to be the kind of parent who administered hard lessons, not nihilistic punishment. He came back a week later, looking sheepish and exhausted. He wanted the usual: a warm meal, a load of laundry, a place to sleep. He wore clothes that had seen better days, and eyes that looked tired in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child getting scolded. I invited him in because I'm not a monster. I fed him. We didn't talk about the money then. We ate in silence. He reached for his phone and scrolled, like people do, avoiding the real conversation. When he finally said, "Mom, I'll pay you back, I swear," it landed like something flimsy tossed across the table. I wanted to teach him the difference between words and actions, promises and proof. You don't get to promise me with no plan, I told him. Words are cheap. He looked up, startled, the way someone who's had sympathy their whole life reacts to a boundary being set. "So, what do you want me to do?" he asked. "You get a job and you keep it," I said. "You work your own way back. You don't live here freeloading on my patience. You earn the ability to be trusted again." He sighed. "That's impossible." "Then start acting like it isn't," I said. And there it was, my petty cross laid out like a map. It was not cruel. It was not vengeful in a monstrous way. It was practical and gritty and painful. I intended to be consistent. I intended to make the friction so constant and the consequences so concrete that he'd feel the true price of what he'd done. I was at once merciless and loving. The combination felt like a medicine I hadn't known I needed. I told him he could stay, but not without a plan. He had to contribute: chores, a job search log, budgets. Not punishments cloaked as rules, but steps to show he could be accountable. It was a pedestrian kind of revenge. Each day I would ask him to prove he'd done something to fix the mess he'd created. No grand spectacle, only small humiliations built of structure. That night, as I locked the back door, I felt oddly calm. Petty revenge doesn't require shouty speeches or a billboard. It requires restraint, an eye for detail, and the patience to watch consequences do their work. It's the slow drip. It's the small avalanche. It's a legal, moral, domestic rectification that says, "You crossed a line. Now live with the cost." And under it all there was a quieter, more personal feeling. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had shoved that teetering line between love and being a doormat back where it belonged. There was a vengeance in that. There was a relief. So I closed on a small, ordinary scene. Me pouring a cup of tea, sitting at the table with the shoebox and the printouts, writing down rules in a tidy little journal that would form the spine of his accountability plan. It was unglamorous, domestic, and precise. It was when you decide you're done being the person who gets walked over, you don't wake up famous or righteous. You wake up bored, precise, and a little smug. That morning after I wrote the rules in my little journal, I felt something like electricity, quiet and steady. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt like armor. It felt like the beginning of a plan that would let him feel the real cost of his choices. If you want revenge that actually changes behavior, it can't be performative. It can't be a viral video or a cold social media takedown. It has to be boring. It has to be administrative. It has to be little humiliations wrapped in paperwork. So that's what I did. I turned into an accountant with a moral agenda. The rules and how I enforced them. I laid them out for him clearly. No theatrics, no yelling, just bullet points written in black ink on an index card taped to the fridge. No borrowing money. Not from my wallet, not from my accounts, not from my cards. If something needs to be paid, we find a way together that doesn't involve me fronting it. No unexplained purchases. If a bank alert pings, he emails me a photo of the receipt within 24 hours. Job hunt log. Daily entries, applications, follow-ups, phone calls. Chore ledger. Actual work around the house with times and signatures. Rent contribution. Small, but real. A percentage of his irregular income goes toward utilities. Accountability meeting. Once a week, 15 minutes. Sit down, show me progress, discuss problems. I wasn't punishing him. I was converting chaos into leverage. It's a weird thing to say out loud, but rules create structure, and structure makes manipulation harder. When your boundaries are fuzzy, the other person can skate along them. When they're concrete, the skating ends. He read the list like somebody read a parking ticket. He ruffled through it, eyes flicking to each line. I watched him watch himself in a way I'd never seen before, sizing up whether he could perform the compliance long enough to make the inconvenience fade. Seriously? A job log, he asked. Yes, a job log, I said. You asked to stay. That comes with conditions. You're treating me like a child. You committed theft, I said. You'll forgive me if I act like it. There was an edge to me then that hadn't been there before. Not cruelty, not rage, just an unshakable sense of what was acceptable in my home. He tried the old lines, the charm offensive, the crocodile sad eyes, the promise to change. He tried to make me feel guilty for taking away the safety net that I had built, not because I liked it gone, but because I had to. I told him to take that guilt and use it to fuel his job hunt. He stomped and he sulked and he tried to find a loophole. The first test came with the car. He'd been using my car whenever his wouldn't start. He'd ask me casually, "Mind if I borrow the car tonight? I'll return it with gas." I was tired of those casual asks. I installed an app that tracked vehicle location, totally legal since the car was mine, and the app was for security. It pinged me one late night with coordinates that didn't match where he'd told me he'd be. He'd said he was at a friend's apartment, but the tag showed he'd driven to a club. I waited until morning. "You said you were with David," I said, showing him the screen over the breakfast dishes. He laughed, that nervous laugh, and tried to turn it into a joke. "Oh, I took a detour, ran into someone." "You drove to a club at 2 a.m. with money you claimed you didn't have," I replied. He froze. It was one drink. "I would have told you. You didn't think to text me? You didn't think to say anything? Last week you used my card and told me you were buying groceries. This is nothing, Mom. Come on." "You're wrong. Nothing is a pattern. I took the car keys and put them in a dish by the front door. Not an angry move, a practical one. If he needed to get somewhere for work, he could ask for the keys that morning. He didn't like the waiting. He had to walk to the bus stop that week for interviews. Walk in the cold, rather than drive 5 minutes to a gig he hadn't planned. The walk was petty. The walk mattered. While he was walking to the bus stop and folding job applications into the right envelopes, I dealt with the money itself. I called the bank and told them about the unauthorized transfers I'd discovered. I wasn't looking to ruin the kid with felony charges. I wanted the bank to know what pattern they were looking at. Fraud investigations can be slow and polite. They can also be a steady, bureaucratic annoyance. A few of his transactions were reversed when the merchants accepted proof of purchase that didn't include my name. A couple more required signed statements. The bank placed alerts and flagged the accounts. That felt good. Not because he was getting publicly shamed at the teller window. No, because he now had to navigate formal processes I'd never made him learn how to handle before. He had to show up and stand in phone queues and talk to strangers with scripted patience. That is humiliating for the person used to sliding through courtesy. It's annoying in a way that can change habits. I also changed the passwords to any account he might have guessed the answers to. Petty? Yes. Effective? Also, yes, when he tried to buy something and got that irritating payment decline message, he came to me and had to explain what the purchase was for. He learned quickly that impulsive luxury met with paperwork. Pro tip: banks and merchants don't like repeated claims without follow up. If you want accountability, give the system something to chew on. It's not revolutionary, it's just annoying. Word travels when the family gossip mill is grinding. I wasn't eager to start a fight with my wider circle, but the way he'd acted, using me like a never empty cash machine, had to become a visible story. Not a smear, but an observable pattern. So I told a couple of friends the truth. I told just the practical parts. Dates, amounts, the bank call. She nodded, made notes in her head, and her loyalty quietly pivoted into action. At the next backyard barbecue with neighbors and mutual acquaintances, people asked how things were. I answered, plain and simple. He took money. We're sorting it out. No melodrama. No hateful speeches. Just simple statements. That made it harder for him to craft a narrative of himself as the victim if neighbors and friends already had quiet awareness. Neighbors started to behave differently. It's a small social thing, but it matters. The guy next door, who'd always waved and offered to borrow a cup of sugar, suddenly asked first if I needed anything. The woman who used to bring casseroles when someone got a cold stopped bringing extras for my son, unless he had plans. I didn't orchestrate this like a puppet master. People noticed and adjusted naturally, which was the delicious part. Natural consequences rarely feel like petty theater. They feel inevitable. I decided to make a few public tests, not to humiliate him in front of a crowd, but to confront the way he expected privilege. Once at a family cookout, he asked me to cover his portion of the food bill because he was tight. When people throw money in communal pots, they expect you to contribute without being asked to show your receipts. I handed him a napkin with the grocery list I'd used, with his name inked at the top and dollar signs penciled in. He fumbled, laughed nervously. Someone made a joke about adulting, and he smiled weakly. It wasn't that anyone was angry with him. It was that his expectation was now visible. He'd habitually expected things. Now those expectations had names and numbers attached. I cannot stress this enough. A real job can be the kind of humiliation that actually regenerates someone. It's not the humiliation of being laughed at. It's the humility of learning to show up, fill out timesheets, be accountable. After a few weeks of walking to morning interviews and returning with rejections, he finally landed a temp position at a printing company. It was nothing glamorous, but you could see it changed the way he carried himself. He arrived at my kitchen table one evening with a greasy application and an embarrassed grin. "They called," he said. "Starts Monday." I nodded and resisted the urge to cheer like an unhinged mother on TV. This was not triumph. This was a test. I wanted him to experience the grind enough times to prefer the grind to the entitlement of taking from me. He worked. He sent me photos of his schedule. He turned in receipts. I checked them. I praised the small things. A day he showed up on time, a text saying he'd paid for groceries. When he did right, I said so. That balance, firm rules and sincere praise, changed the tone between us. He learned the math of earning and how it tasted different than begging. Petty, legal, and practical, the boundary ballet. People confuse petty with mean. For me, petty had rules. It had a legal backbone. I would not break the law. I would not publicly shame him on social media. I called banks. I used passwords. I issued small, consistent inconveniences until his entitlement smelled stale. He tested the limits. He tried to borrow my card from my purse while I was in the shower one day, hands slick with the delinquency of youth. I had never felt more satisfied than when I opened my bathroom door and simply said, "Can I help you find a taxi?" He stood there, card in hand, flush with outrage turned into stupidity, and then, realizing he'd been caught, slipped out silently. No yelling, no police, just an exposure so small and domestic it cut deeper than a headline. I called the creditor companies and disputed a few charges that were clearly fraudulent. I transferred funds to accounts he didn't have access to. I set up automatic alerts. It felt mean, but it also felt like triage. The goal wasn't emotional harm. The goal was simply to make the path from entitlement to reward longer and steeper. He slipped, of course. Humans do. He borrowed a neighbor's power tool without asking, promising to return it. He forgot. The neighbor called me because apparently neighbors still do that, and I simply asked him to put the tool on the porch if he couldn't return it. He did, late at night, sheepish as a kid caught with cookies. No fireworks, no melodrama. Then came the more serious test. He got an extra night shift at the bar and decided to bring friends over when he was supposed to be working. They invited people into the house. They left a mess. I told him he had to clean the entire living room and the kitchen by noon the next day, showing me a checklist with photos. He did. It took him from noon until 8 at night. He texted me at the end, exhausted. I didn't realize how much work it is. I replied, then don't make it again. The small daily grinds were changing his instinct. They weren't turning him into Mr. Perfect. They were turning him into someone who could see the arithmetic of effort. He started to pay attention to how small acts accumulate. As the weeks turned into months, friends picked sides, not as a dramatic gesture, but simply because patterns settle. People who had been too politely neutral began to offer help. An older cousin offered him an informal mentorship on budgeting. A colleague from the temp job texted a link to a local trades program. Those were small kindnesses, but the pattern was now, if he wanted support, he had to work for it. Not everyone was on his case. Some people still sympathized with him in a broad, generational way. Young people have it hard. So be it. I wasn't seeking to humiliate him publicly with a band of torches. I wanted him to see the immediate consequences and to make different choices. That's all. There's always that moment where you wonder if you've gone too far. For me, that night arrived quietly at 2 a.m. when the house was too still and the small victories felt oddly hollow. He was asleep on the couch, his face slack and exhausted. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, the weekly accountability meeting ahead of me. I could have forgiven him. I could have smiled and told him to try again. But then I found another charge, small, not spectacular, on the credit card. A streaming service subscription for an account he didn't tell me about. Tickets for a comedy show. Not theft the way the big withdrawals had been, but a patchwork of small deceit. When he woke in the morning, I had the receipts arranged in a neat pile, like a reminder. He looked at them, and his face shifted the way it does when the mask slips to reveal something he can't hide. Real remorse, not for my sake, but because he realized someone else had cataloged his life. I'm sorry, he said. I'll cancel them. I'll stop. You've said that, I said. I know, he whispered. I know. This time, he called the company, canceled the subscriptions, and showed me the confirmation emails. He worked the next day and came home and put in an extra hour washing dishes. That was the turning point. Not because it was dramatic, but because he was now doing the boring, humiliating labor of consistency. I gave small praise. Good job, I said. It wasn't theatrical. It was mortar. He looked up, surprised by the sound of approval. That's when I knew the plan might actually be working. It would be easy to paint this as relentless cruelty. It wasn't. There were moments of real tenderness because the kid I raised was still the same person who, when he was little, used to leave me sticky notes that said, "Love you, Mom." You can't burn that out with an index card list of rules. You don't want to. When he came to me in tears one night and said, "I'm trying," it's just I sat with him. I didn't lecture. I listened. He told me about the bar owner cutting his hours. He told me about a girlfriend who had been more trouble than help. He told me about nights he'd be cold and hungry and too proud to ask. In those moments, I unrolled the map of my petty plan and smoothed the edges. Borders have to be firm, but borders can also allow mercy. I reminded him, pay me back. Show me progression. Keep the job. Don't treat this like a performance. I wanted him to fail his way into new habits, not to feel like every second was a court proceeding. That's harsh to hear, I know. But the balance of firmness and care changed the dynamic from punishment to rehabilitation. The final piece of the petty strategy was subtle. Let him rebuild a reputation slowly, but not for free. When family gatherings resumed, I didn't stage confrontations. I didn't point at the list taped to the fridge and ring a dinner bell. Instead, I walked into rooms with quiet confidence and let his small acts of responsibility speak. If he offered to help set the table or loaded the dishwasher without being asked, I praised him. When he paid half for a pizza at a small family dinner, I thanked him. Small public wins mattered. They made the entire environment less permissive of entitlement. He noticed. So did other people. One night my sister, yes, the one who always had something to judge, commented on how he'd seemed different lately. I let the observation hang in the air. I didn't boast. I didn't score points. I simply let the story unfold. After months of this, walks to the bus stop, job logs, canceled subscriptions, and chore checklists, he stopped hitting my account like a candy jar. He had become not a saint, but a person who understood the arithmetic of trust. He had to ask now instead of assume. He had to present receipts, not excuses. Was that petty? Yes. Was it cruel? Sometimes. Was it effective? Absolutely. There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from breaking someone, but from showing them the cost of their choices until they either choose to change or the cost becomes intolerable. I didn't want to smash him into the pavement. I wanted to make him step onto the treadmill and sweat. One afternoon, months later, he turned to me and said quietly, thanks, for not making it worse. There was a load of complicated feelings buried under that sentence. Regret, humility, resignation. I didn't hug him, but I nodded. You did the work, I said. You earned it. He didn't smile the big, entitled smile he used to wear. He had a new expression, smaller, more thoughtful. It was a look I hadn't taught him explicitly, but I had modeled it. Expect consequences, meet them, and keep going. If you imagine revenge as a single dramatic moment, you'll miss what actually shifts people. The quiet victories are the ones where life quietly rearranges itself. Stolen money doesn't vanish into an excuse, it becomes a ledger entry. The privilege that let them assume your resources aren't infinite becomes friction you can't escape. The person who expects forgiveness now has to produce a plan. When I taped my index card to the fridge and enforced the rules, I was not trying to be mean. I was trying to protect my future self. And in the process, his future self became a little more accountable. There were nights I still woke to old aches, memories of him as a toddler with chubby knees learning to ride a bike. There were nights I wondered whether I'd hardened into someone less patient than he needed. But then I'd remember the withdrawal on the bank statement, the string of excuses, the night he came home smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. And the clarity would return. Petty revenge, in my case, looked like a ledger, a list, a walk to the bus stop, a canceled subscription. It looked like quiet enforcement and occasional mercy. And it worked not because I humiliated him publicly, but because I removed the soft landing he'd become used to. That's the end of Act 2. I can keep going. Act 3 will explore the wider social fallout as the sun slowly rebuilds, the ways family members react, some supportive, some resistant, and the deeper emotional reckoning as you realize the cost of being both parent and enforcer. Want me to continue straight into Act 3 now? It started at my sister's house, one of those mandatory family dinners where everyone brings a casserole and judgment in equal measure. He walked in behind me, slouched, quiet, and carrying a store-bought pie like it weighed 100 pounds. Normally, he'd come empty-handed. This time, he'd actually paid for something. It wasn't much, but it mattered to me. Of course, my sister noticed. Her, oh, you brought dessert? Him, yeah. Thought I'd contribute. Her, well, that's new. She said it with a laugh, but the air tightened. He went red. I wanted to shield him, but I didn't. He needed to sit with that heat. I watched him put the pie on the table like a peace offering, then retreat to the corner. He hated being under a microscope, but that was the consequence of his actions. He had built the reputation. I wasn't going to erase it for him. Family gossip is faster than Wi-Fi. Within a week, my cousin texted, heard about the money thing. You doing okay? It wasn't cruel. It wasn't judgmental. But it was proof. Word was out. People were whispering, connecting dots, reshaping their mental image of my son. I didn't lie. I told them, yeah, he took money. We're working on it. Some sympathized with him. Kids make mistakes. Others sympathized with me. You're too soft on him. Both sides stung a little, but I didn't care which side they picked. The important thing was, he couldn't hide behind charm anymore. At home, he exploded. Him, why are you telling people? Me, I didn't tell them. They noticed. Him, you're making me look bad. Me, you made yourself look bad when you stole. That landed. He hated it. His face twisted, but he had no comeback. Him, I'm your son. You're supposed to protect me. Me, I'm supposed to raise you. Protection and cover-up aren't the same thing. He stormed out. I didn't chase him. I sat with my coffee and let him stew. Petty revenge isn't fireworks. It's silence that forces reflection. He got lazy one week and skipped his job logs. When the accountability meeting rolled around, I put the empty page between us. Me, where's the record? Him, I've been working. Isn't that enough? Me, show me. Him, this is humiliating. Me, so is stealing from your mother. He slammed his fist on the table. For a moment, I thought he'd walk out for good. But instead, he sat back down, quiet, angry, and wrote the damn entries. That was the turning point. He started to understand that humiliation wasn't my weapon. It was the natural consequence of his own behavior. At the next barbecue, he tried to crack jokes, act normal. But people weren't laughing as freely. Trust is a strange currency. It drains fast and fills slow. I overheard my brother-in-law mutter, "Better keep your wallet close." My son heard it too. His shoulders stiffened. He pretended not to care, but I saw it land. That was my revenge working, not through screaming, but through slow erosion of reputation. He was learning that rebuilding trust wasn't about words, it was about proof. Small wins and his resistance. To be fair, he started doing small things right. Paid half the water bill one month. Showed up on time for work. Even returned the car keys without me asking. But then he'd slip. He'd buy new shoes with money he claimed he didn't have. Or he'd conveniently forget to pay his share of groceries. Each time, I'd bring out the receipts. No yelling. Just cold, factual evidence. It drove him insane. He told me once, "Him, you're like the IRS in this house." Me, good. The IRS doesn't get robbed. He didn't laugh. I did. This wasn't about ruining him. It was about balance. Every time he tried to slide back into old habits, my petty little systems caught him. Bank alerts, chore logs, neighbors who weren't as forgiving as before. He hated it. I loved it, because I wasn't screaming anymore. I wasn't begging him to change. I had built a system where his own actions trapped him. And slowly, painfully, he began to realize life wasn't going to be soft anymore. There's a moment in every plan where you wonder if you've set something in motion that you can't control. Not because you're scared the plan will fail, but because you might have underestimated the cost of success. That night, when my petty paper and boundary strategy hit its limit, I finally understood the difference between teaching and wounding. I also realized how close the line can be between firmness and cruelty. This act is the ugly, honest part. The moment he pushed back so hard the structure I'd built creaked. It didn't collapse, but it groaned loud enough for the neighbors to hear. The night he crossed the line. We'd been doing the routine for months. The job, the chore log, the job applications, the little payments he made toward utilities. Things had steadied. I let my guard down a little for practicality. because life is easier when you stop micromanaging every breath your adult child takes. So I shouldn't have been surprised when I woke to an odd ping on my phone 2 weeks after a weekend of small calm. The bank alert said an ATM withdrawal had been attempted at a machine across town in the middle of the night. My chest tightened. My fingers hovered, then opened the mobile app, digging through recent transactions. There it was, an attempted transfer that didn't clear, and then a smaller successful transfer to a service I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped the way it does when you step off a curb you thought was there. I really thought, that the ledger we'd built would be enough. But the truth is that some people, when cornered by consequences, choose escalation instead of surrender. I went to the room where he was sleeping. He'd slept on the couch the previous night because he'd wanted to think, and I turned the lamp on. His eyes blinked awake, unfocused. "Mom," he said, voice raw, "did you try to take money from my account tonight?" I asked. His face changed in a microsecond. The mouth tightened, the jaw worked. He could have lied. He could have stumbled through a small excuse. Instead, there was a brittle frankness in him I recognized as panic. I needed cash. I thought," he coughed. "I thought if I moved some of your money into my account, you wouldn't notice for a day. Then I get paid, move it back." That sentence was the rawest form of entitlement I'd ever heard. It was the logic of a man used to safety nets, recalculated into a desperate, stupid plan. "You thought," I echoed. "You thought you could take from your mother and put it back later? You thought what exactly?" He looked down. "I don't know. I'm sorry." The apology felt thin. I walked into the kitchen and flipped on the kettle, the mundane noise a tether to normalcy. When I turned back, I had a plan already lined up in my head that had nothing to do with melodrama. It had to do with consequence. "You're leaving," I said. He blinked. "What? You're leaving? Tonight?" I say it calmly. "No theatrics. And you're going to open an account that we both can see. You're going to be accountable for every penny. And we are calling the bank to report a fraudulent attempt." His reaction was a mixture of fury and pleading. "You can't do that. You can't kick me out. I have nowhere to go." "That's not my problem. You made a decision." He didn't leave immediately. He packed slowly, grabbing a hoodie, his toothbrush, a few t-shirts. He glared at me as if this was my betrayal, not his. Then he walked out into the night. When the door closed behind him, I did not feel triumphant. I felt hollow, with a small ember of relief beneath. That feeling followed me to the phone as I dialed the fraud line and laid out what had happened. Quietly, the bank advised that they would flag the account and could initiate an investigation. They described the bureaucratic steps in patient monotone, as if emotional theft were a form they documented in boxes. When the police came, 2 neighborhood officers who knew me, they were gentle and professional. It is strange how criminality has a shape when you describe it. Attempted unauthorized transfer, suspicious ATM activity. They asked me to provide statements, to sign forms. They recommended I get a temporary fraud alert on my credit report. I wrote things down in a notebook, dates, times, the sequence of events. Each detail felt like a shield. There was no joy in it, just the mechanics of undoing a breach. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had been whispering now had something to latch onto that wasn't rumor. My son's attempted theft stopped being a private household problem and became a fact on paper. That mattered in ways I'd underestimated. There's legitimacy in documentation. Suddenly people stop assuming it's a family squabble and start seeing it as something more serious. He reappeared 2 days later with eyes bleary and defenses raised. We went together to the bank. Walking into the lobby felt like walking into a courtroom. His hand trembled as he shoved an ID at the clerk. He fumbled for words. I was going to pay it back," he said, voice too loud. The bank manager, efficient, polite, explained the process. "Unauthorized access is treated seriously. Mrs. She said my name when she printed forms. We'll need a signed report." He shifted uncomfortably as he watched me sign the reports, documenting the attempt. He wanted me to stop. He wanted me to take the form back to the empty table and smile, to say, "Oh, it's all right." But signing the form was not about punishment. It was about establishing that boundaries had been breached and that the consequences were real when they were made visible to a neutral institutional system. Afterward, he grabbed me outside the bank, voice low and desperate. "Do you realize what you're doing to me? My job will find out. I have to explain this to people. You're humiliating me." "You humiliated yourself," I said. "You tried to steal from your mother. The only humiliation here is the dignity you abandoned." He didn't like that. He spat and stormed away, fists clenched. When he tried to turn it into a narrative of victimhood, I refused. I would not be the instrument that covered for him. People sometimes confuse accountability with cruelty, but accountability is the path to repair if someone wants to take it. Cruelty is covering up a wrong for convenience. The fallout rippled beyond me and him. Our extended family divided quietly into camps, not in shouting matches, but in the way they treated him in the grocery store aisle or whether they invited him to game night. Those small exclusions felt enormous to someone used to being the charismatic center of social life. A couple of his friends tried to mediate it in the early days, offering half-hearted apologies on his behalf. Some said he's young, he'll learn. Others, more practical, told him to step up and act like an adult. One of his former buddies, Tom, who'd always had a tiny instinct for fairness, showed up in my kitchen one afternoon with a printed copy of a job posting and a small handwritten note. "He needs structure," Tom said. "I'll put in a good word." There was no gloating in his voice, just pragmatic help. That help mattered more than any performance of shame. Weeks in, with the bank investigating and the police having a report on file, I gave him a clean ultimatum, the kind that makes grown men look small. Pay restitution as agreed, get a job, no more access to my accounts, and start rebuilding trust through actions, not promises. "I will help you," I said, "but not until you've demonstrated you're serious. You can start by accepting the repayment plan. Small, steady payments that you arrange on your own. Small steps." "I can't do that," he whispered. "I don't have the money." "Then get the money," I said. "It sounds heartless when you write it down." But the alternative, letting him slip back into the soft world of borrowed comforts, felt like permitted theft. I couldn't do that. I would not be complicit. A particularly bitter thing happened when he began trying to gaslight the narrative with others. He told friends that I'd overreacted, that the system was picking on him. He framed my insistence on documentation as me being controlling. It was a familiar tactic. Blame the enforcer for enforcing. Some people bought it at first. That's the discomforting reality. Personality types who manipulate can often flip situations to make the person asking for responsibility appear irrational. But the evidence was solid now. The bank had records, the police had a report, and I had receipts. The truth had teeth. I refused to let his conversational maneuvering reframe the reality we both lived inside. He did manage to find a second job. It was a slaughterhouse of part-time shifts and hurried hours, but he worked. He paid back what he could. We negotiated a repayment plan that was reasonable and set in stone. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make him a hero. It made him somebody who had to face ledger entries and accounting for his existence. There were hard nights where he sat up late calculating bills, head in his hands, asking how to re-enter life without scamming the people around him. I would sometimes sit across and give him small practical advice. Open a savings account, set aside a fixed percentage, automate transfers. Those were things no one had taught him because it was easier to throw money at the problem than to teach fiscal responsibility. I'll be the first to admit there were moments I felt cruel. There were nights I wondered if my petty rules were breaking him instead of making him whole. But the difference between breaking someone and holding them to consequence is subtle. Breaking someone looks permanent and pulverizing. Holding them to consequence is temporary hardening that can lead to growth. There was an incident later, call it a relapse, that almost undid everything. One night, while I slept, someone came into the kitchen. I woke up to the clatter of cupboards and someone trying to slide an envelope into his jacket. I moved like something older and faster, caught the edge of the fabric, and turned on the light. It was the neighbor's kid, actually a young man who'd been doing odd jobs and who thought he could be helpful. But my son had been planning something else. He'd intended to borrow a small amount and rely on the neighbor to cover for him. That neighbor had a soft spot and a history, so the setup seemed logical in his mind. "What are you doing?" I snapped. "I can explain," the neighbor began. "No explanation," I said. "Hands out of the jar." My son went pale. I didn't shout. I simply opened my drawer, took out the notebook with the repayment plan, and laid it on the table, folding it open to the unpaid line items. "Choose," I said. "Ask for help by the book, or do this and accept that you're not welcome here until you figure it out." He crumpled in a chair and cried, not sobbing like a child, but the kind of quiet tears that come from losing the illusion that someone will always catch you. That night, he left again for a little while. He called the next morning to say he'd booked a temporary room. He'd take every shift and that he'd see it through. Not everyone heals in one stretch. Not every relapse takes the same form. But the thing is, each relapse restored my resolve that the strategies had to be durable and consistent. Mercy without boundaries is just a return to old injury. Months passed. He paid back a chunk of the money. The bank's investigation recorded patterns. The police files sat like a quiet reminder of what had been attempted. People in the neighborhood who had offered casual condoning now nodded at me in quiet approval. My son's social life thinned. Not maliciously, he took steps to reshape it. Smaller circles, more straightforward people. People who were okay with him working shifts and learning to be reliable. We resumed a sort of cautious truce. It wasn't the same as before. The trust had been damaged. The implicit contract that home is always a soft landing had been renegotiated into something with new clauses. Repay, contribute, be accountable. It was a more adult contract. It was also a lonelier one. Reflection in the aftermath of the breaking point. Looking back on that time, that deep, raw period of checking bank statements and fielding neighborly questions and sitting across from my son with the ledger between us, I can say this: the breaking point was necessary. It was the point at which the soft pattern of entitlement met an immovable object. It hurt him, yes. It wounded him. But it also taught him something he needed to learn. There were nights I wondered if I'd done the right thing. I wrestled with the maternal guilt that tells you to protect your child at all costs. There were also nights I felt a rogue pride because the old pattern had been ended. That ambivalence is real. It's messy. I'll own it. If you ask whether I'd recommend turning your home into a Spartan zone of rules and receipts to everyone who crosses a line, no, I wouldn't. But if someone has been consistent in taking advantage of your kindness, then yes, something must change. The shape of that change should be protective for you and instructional for them. And sometimes, the best revenge is the hard work of boundaries and adult consequences that teach rather than destroy. That was the arc we were on, complicated, imperfect, but honest. I had forced him to confront an uglier truth about himself. The cost was steep, but the currency was accountability. When you look back on a storm, it never feels as loud in memory as it did while it was raging. The thunder becomes a story, the lightning becomes an anecdote, and the floodwaters shrink down to damp carpets and warped floorboards. But when you were standing in it, soaked, shivering, clutching at anything that floated, it felt like the world was ending. That's how I think of those months when my own son tried to steal from me, and I chose to fight back with petty, deliberate revenge. The aftermath wasn't a clean sunrise where everything suddenly felt healed. It was patchwork, some victories, some relapses, and a whole lot of quiet recalibration. Revenge may feel sharp in the moment, but what it really leaves behind is silence. And it's in that silence that you decide who you'll be moving forward. After the breaking point, life didn't snap back to before. Too much had been revealed. My son wasn't just a troubled young man fumbling through adulthood. He was someone who had crossed a line with his own parent, and I was someone who had proven I would fight to defend my dignity, even against family. That truth colored every conversation we had from then on. He came around less often, at first out of shame, then out of necessity. His temporary housing wasn't glamorous. I know he hated the fluorescent lights, the bland beige walls, the silence that hung over shared kitchens and cheap rentals. He told me once, grudgingly, "I get why you did it. I just didn't think you'd actually go through with it." And there it was, the confession that he had counted on my softness, on my love, as a shield against consequences. That acknowledgement alone was worth months of pettiness and paperwork. I didn't smile when he said it. I just nodded. Now you know I meant it. He found steadier work eventually. Not glamorous, warehouse shifts, late night deliveries, the kind of jobs that leave your back sore and your clothes stained. But work is work. Every paycheck chipped away at the debt. Small amounts moved back toward me in scheduled increments. Watching those repayments arrive was surreal. Seeing my son, the same boy I'd once packed lunches for, now sending me digital transfers with labels like payment number 5 and utilities contribution. It was transactional, yes, but it was also proof. Proof that he could function like an adult when cornered. Proof that boundaries could make him stand upright instead of collapse. We still had arguments. Petty ones sometimes about money, about his attitude, about whether he was really trying. But even those arguments were different now. Before, he would have shouted, slammed doors, sulked like a teenager in a grown man's body. Now, there was restraint, a recognition that if he pushed too hard, if he crossed another line, I would follow through again. And honestly, that recognition was the revenge I had wanted all along, not to hurt him, but to make him respect the line. Of course, family didn't stay silent. Some relatives thought I'd gone too far. "He's your son," they whispered, as though that word erased responsibility. Others quietly respected it, though they never said it out loud. I'd catch it in the way they'd lower their voices around me, in the way they stopped asking me for small favors they'd once taken for granted. That's the funny thing about drawing boundaries. Once people see you enforce one, they start realizing where the lines are for themselves. My petty revenge on him, turning his theft into a system of consequences, echoed outward. Cousins who used to guilt-trip me for loans stopped trying. Neighbors who'd asked for just a little help started finding other sources. It wasn't just my son who learned from this. It was everyone who thought I was a soft touch. Months later, he came by one night, worn out from a double shift. He sat at the kitchen table, same spot where so many of our battles had been fought, and stared at the wood grain like it held answers. "Mom," he said slowly, "do you hate me?" It wasn't defiant. It wasn't manipulative. It was raw. I put down the dish towel in my hand and sat across from him. "No, I hate what you did. I hate that you thought you could do it. But I don't hate you." He blinked, surprised. Maybe he thought I'd softened. Maybe he thought I'd hand him back the comfort he'd forfeited. But I didn't stop there. Love doesn't mean letting you walk all over me. Love doesn't mean I fund your mistakes. If anything, love is the reason I drew the line. Because I don't want you to become a man who thinks stealing from family is normal. Do you understand that? He nodded, eyes wet, but he didn't argue. And for once, that silence wasn't hostile. It was acceptance. Here's the thing no one tells you about revenge. It doesn't heal the wound. It doesn't erase the betrayal. It doesn't make things like they were. What it does is reclaim your power. It says, you don't get to write the story of what you did to me. I do. My son will never forget that his mother reported him, made him sign papers, turned his theft into official records. He'll never forget that every time he thought of taking a shortcut, I was there with a ledger, a lockbox, and an iron spine. And I'll never forget that the petty steps I took were what forced him to look at himself honestly. Our relationship didn't end in reconciliation straight out of a movie. It ended in something messier but truer, a cautious truce. A mutual respect edged with scars. He doesn't ask me for money now. He doesn't test the locks. And I don't pretend he's innocent. Sometimes I still ask myself if I went too far. If I should have chosen compassion over consequence. If revenge poisoned something that could have been mended with softer hands. But then I remember the night I caught him trying to pull money that wasn't his. The look in his eyes when he admitted he thought I'd never fight back. And I know the truth. The line had to be drawn. Maybe my revenge wasn't pretty. Maybe it wasn't the kind of justice you brag about at family dinners. But it worked. It forced change. And in the end, it gave me back the one thing he tried to steal, my dignity. And that's the story of how my own son tried to rob me, and how my revenge wasn't loud or flashy, but petty, relentless, and effective. If you've ever had to draw the hardest line with someone you love, you know how messy it gets. But sometimes messy is the only way forward. Speech Balloon, tell me in the comments, would you have gone as far as I did? Or do you think I should have handled it differently? Thumbs up, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more tales of revenge.